The most sinister and mysterious of all the dark magicians who practice their craft in Ahai by the shadow are the Shadowbinders, who alone venture outside the enormous land walls of Ahai to brave the barren wasteland known as the Shadowlands. The Shadowbinders really are the perfect kind of sinister and mysterious, though, as far as fantasy world building goes. They're from the most remote, mysterious part of the world, Ahai by the shadow, but they're heavily involved in the main plot. One of the many reasons all that Ahai stuff in the Far East isn't just fun world building, but rather part of the story, which you should consider as, part of the story. And I'm talking about Melisandre and Quaithe, of course, both of whom claim to be Shadowbinders who have studied magic for years in Ahai. But as you may have noticed, Melisandre and Quaithe appear to do very different things with their Shadowbinding powers, and that leaves us confused as to what Shadowbinding actually is. The fact that Melisandre is both Shadowbinder and Relorist is the key to unraveling this mystery. The Relorists actually have a massive Red Temple in Ahai, and given that Melisandre has been a slave owned by the Red Temple since she was a child, the Relorists would have been the one directing her to study Shadowbinding in Ahai, and that implies a connection between Relorism and Shadowbinding, and let me tell you, there is one. Shadowbinder Melisandre is obviously looking for Azor Ahai reborn in northern Westeros. She feels like he should be around there somewhere, and obviously she is set up to play a part in Jon's resurrection and to help him fulfill the prophecy. And then we have Shadowbinder Quaithe dispensing her cryptic and mysterious advice exclusively to Daenerys, who is the other very safe bet to be Azor Ahai reborn. And by the way, I did do both Jon and Dany Azor Ahai reborn videos in case you're interested in the evidence for both of them. But it's not just Shadowbinder Quaithe in Dany's corner. Of course, the High Priest of Relorism, Benero, has publicly proclaimed Daenerys to be the fulfillment of the Azor Ahai reborn prophecy. So both Shadowbinders and Reloris seem concerned with Azor Ahai reborn. Melisandre is both, and we have two Shadowbinders advising Jon and Dany. So, Shadowbinding is very important to understand. And although it may sound weird at first, Shadowbinding may also help us understand the nature of the others, the enemy of Azor Ahai reborn. So there's just Shadowbinding everywhere. Now, I did promise a Stygiai video this week, and I am working on that. It's expanded to what happened to Ahai, Stygiai, and the Shadowlands. And while I was working on it, I sort of spun off this Shadowbinder script, and while I was exploring this connection between Relorism and Shadowbinding, I think I figured out who Relor is. So make sure you watch to the end of the video, and I will reveal to you the identity of Relor, or at least my theory about that. Many people in the story call him a demon. Some people have wondered if he might be an ancient dragon spirit, so yeah. Stay tuned to the end of the video. Thanks for clicking on the video. I am David Lightbringer. Please make sure you're subscribed to my channel, and then I will have that Stygiai and the Shadowlands video out next week, I promise. I hope this Shadowbinder video isn't like a letdown for anyone, and shout out to Sven Sauer for this incredible Shadowbinder artwork. Alright, so the first place that we want to look if we're trying to figure out what is Shadowbinding would be Melisandre's Shadowbaby. That's gotta be Shadowbinding, right? It's some kind of shadow that is bound to Melisandre's will. It's gotta do what she says. And Melisandre is a Shadowbinder, so it would seem that she is doing some Shadowbinding here. Now, Shadowbaby, of course, is our fandom nickname for it. It's really a shadow version of Stannis. Davos recognizes it as Stannis' form as soon as he sees it. And Melisandre talks about drawing off of Stannis' life fires to make the shadow. So we can say that the shadow is effectively cast from the light of his life fires, which are dwindling, sadly. And of course, there does seem to be a limit on how much you can draw on someone's life fires to make shadows, as we see Stannis noticeably more haggard after each Shadowbaby, and after two of them, Melisandre says that one more might kill him. But, with a man whose life fires burn high and hot. Well, then she'd have something to work with. Another cool aspect of the Shadowbaby is that Stannis, his consciousness is still linked to the shadow. He admits to Davos that he dreamt Renly's death. And I think Stannis is in denial about this, but yeah, you did that, buddy. You did that. You killed your brother. So yeah, it's why you feel guilty. So again, the point is that that was no dream. That was Stannis actually experiencing what the Shadowbaby was doing, which means he was still linked to it. So I mentioned at the top, there's this big potential connection between Relorism and Shadowbinding. And indeed, when Melisandre has the Shadowbaby, notice that the mechanism involves flame and shadow. Melisandre is drawing from Stannis' life fires to make the shadow. She actually glows visibly, giving off light and heat. And both Melisandre and many of the acolytes of R'hllor all repeatedly refer to R'hllor as the god of flame and shadow. And when Davos is rowing Melisandre into Storm's End and past the ward so she can give birth to the Shadowbaby, the one that kills Sir Courtney Penrose, Melisandre is trying to justify this whole, Stannis killing his brother thing, and Davos correctly, I think, says that shadows are the servants of darkness. But Melisandre says, no, it's chill. Shadows are the servants of light. It's all good. But I question this because technically it's the thing that obstructs light that casts the shadow. But I digress. More than anything, it's really Melisandre's repeated use of human sacrifice and her desire to burn children alive that have us questioning her philosophy. And setting aside the human sacrifice thing for just a minute and focusing on the philosophical idea of flame and shadow, Quaithe's philosophy is actually very similar to Melisandre's. She repeatedly tells Daenerys that to touch the light, you must pass beneath the shadow. And that sounds a lot like shadows are the servants of light, doesn't it? Now, interestingly, we've never seen Quaithe have anything to do with the kind of shadow binding that Melisandre does to create the Shadow Assassin. Apart from Quaithe's extensive use of the Valyrian glass candle, which does actually require a little bit of fire magic, the only other magic that we've seen Quaithe perform is that little two-finger touch that she puts on Dany's wrist in Qarth. Seemingly that is a way for Quaithe to track Dany and contact her via glass candle. So I don't know if that really qualifies as shadow binding, more like shadow linking or something, maybe. Really, Quaithe's main tie to the idea of the shadow is her tie to the shadow, the capital S shadow, by Shai. Quaithe is always going on about the truth and knowledge that is waiting there for Dany. And I do think that Marwyn the Mage, as I've said many times, is probably bringing one of the glass candles that he has access to Slaver's Bay. After all, he thinks he's traveling halfway across the world to help potentially Azor Ahai Reborn save the world. So put yourself in Marwyn's shoes. If you're going on a mission that long and that important, obviously you'd take something as powerful as a glass candle. After all, the Citadel's not really looking after them closely, and oh, by the way, Marwyn the Mage is the Archmaester of the Higher Mysteries, which means the glass candles are in some sort of display case in Marwyn's study anyway. One of the reasons that I think that, besides plain logic, is that we do know that George has talked about originally intending to have had Dany travel to Asshai, but that he scrapped that idea because, we just didn't have a few more months and books for Dany to make that long of a journey. But it's not hard to see that that same plot point of Dany traveling to Asshai to learn the truth that Quaithe is talking about could easily be accomplished with a Valyrian glass candle. So that's how Dany's probably going to learn the final information she needs about Azor Ahai and the Long Night. And Quaithe's role going forward will probably continue to be revealing knowledge to Dany. Knowledge from Asshai and from the Shadow. However, if a mysterious black shadow assassin shows up at a convenient time to kill one of Dany's enemies in Qarth or Vaes Dothrak, we'll know that Quaithe sent it. And we'll also know that somewhere in Asshai, some lucky man got to see what's under the mask. Or maybe she doesn't take the mask off. I don't know. Let's stop speculating. So getting back to Melisandre's shadow babies, there's just a couple of questions that I want to pose at this point in the video essay. Number one, why is Melisandre's shadow assassin blocked by those wards at Storm's End when those are almost certainly wards that were set by the First Men and or the Children of the Forest to stop the others and the Whites back during the time of the Long Night? They're not Andal wards after all, so that would be the logical reason and the logical people to have put them there. But they apparently stop shadow babies too, so that's an interesting question. And the next question, what happens to the shadow assassins after their mission is complete? Presumably they dissipate because we don't hear about them running around and killing more people. And what's interesting is in the scene when we meet Melisandre, which is the Crescent prologue of A Clash of Kings, we hear Patchface singing about the shadows come to dance, my lord, the shadows come to stay. But again, Melisandre's shadows don't seem to stay, so what shadows is Patchface singing about? So the answer to all those questions is the others. That's right, the others. They are the shadows who come to stay. And the reason why those ancient wards intended to stop the others and their Whites also stop the shadow babies is because the shadow babies and the others are, I think, similar in nature. And I know it might seem like a curveball to bring up the others, and we are going to come back to the Shadowbinders proper very quickly, but I do want to point out, and I think this is really important, Shadowbinding is a magical technique. It is not the monopoly of a group of specific Shadowbinders that live in Asshai, just as using fire magic is a magical technique and not the monopoly of the R'hllorists. The Valyrian sorcerers used extensive fire magic, and were never told that they were R'hllorists. So yes, Shadowbinding is a magical technique, and it can potentially help us understand the nature of the others. And this is actually something that both Michael Talks About Stuff and Gray Area, check out their videos linked to the description, have hit on as well, that shadowbinding was a part of the creation of the others. So first of all, the others are called shadows just a bunch of times. It's usually white shadows or pale shadows, sometimes cold shadows. And just as the shadow babies are partially insubstantial, but can become solid enough when they need to kill Renly, the others are much the same. They don't break the snow when they walk, and Tormund makes it sound like they can turn into a mist. But they can also have sword fights with people like Waymar and kill people, and if you stab them with dragon glass, they melt. So the others are white shadows instead of black, but they are both essentially shadow assassins that are created through the sacrifice of children. And so, if the others are similar in nature to the shadow babies in some way, this could explain why Patchface was singing about them when Melisandre was there. Not only because her shadow babies are similar, but because Melisandre and Stannis' arc is obviously headed north to eventually confront the others. Or at least to help Jon and other people do that. And then of course I just mentioned Waymar, his famous line as he prepared to fight the other, "Dance with me then," may be a match for Patchface talking about the shadows come to dance. So really the important thing to understand here is that the legend of Knights King and Queen sounds a lot like Stannis and Melisandre. And I think Martin is encouraging us to compare Knights Queen and Melisandre and Stannis and Knights King by having Stannis take the Night Fort as his seat. And that's where Knights King ruled, obviously. That's where he took Knights Queen. So let's compare. Melisandre and Stannis have sexual intercourse, so she's taking his seed and his life fires to make the shadow babies. And that's why I said they are created with the sacrifice of children. These are Stannis' little swimmers that are going along with his life fires, a more esoteric concept. And so we can say that the children that would have been conceived by Stannis and Mel are instead paying for the creation of the shadows. That compares very well to the legend of Knights King. It's said that he gave his seed and soul to Knights Queen. So seed and life fire, seed and soul, sounds like the same thing. It's probably sex magic. Shout out Red Hot Chili Peppers, one of the greatest albums of all time. Educate yourself, kids. And then we are told that Knights King and Queen were discovered to have been sacrificing to the others. But we know what that means. Craster sacrifices to the others, quote unquote, and that means that he gives his sons to the others to be either transformed into others or consumed by the others to sustain their existence, something like that. So it's basically the same situation. Knights Queen taking seed and soul from Knights King and using that to pay for the creation of others who are white shadows. So just to make it simple, the Fire Witch had black shadow babies and the Ice Witch had white shadow babies. So here I want to mention the very important theory about Knights Queen and Melisandre by one Durin Durndon from the Westeros.org forums. He proposed that Knights Queen, whose proper name is actually the Corpse Queen. Knights Queen is nowhere in the books, that's what we call her. She's called the Corpse Queen. But Durin Durndon said, hey, she doesn't really sound like a corpse. She sounds more like an other, or like an icy version of Melisandre, some sort of ice priestess who, through using ice magic, has transformed her nature. Because that's what's happening to Melisandre. The more she uses fire magic, it's searing and blackening her insides and transforming her into an entity that doesn't need to eat or sleep in order to exist. She is sustained by R'hllor power. So Durin Durndon said, hey, Knights Queen, maybe she's called the Corpse Queen because she raises corpses. And Melisandre should be able to raise the dead and probably will raise Jon, of course. And the whole thing about Knights King, falling in love with her, chasing her and catching her and then having children with her, that just doesn't sound like she was a white. It sounds more like she's a beautiful, otherish ice witch. And I hope you've been enjoying all this Knights Queen Ice Witch artwork. I've got a lot of it. I'm trying to show it in rotation here. And this is also a good time to mention that we'll never use AI art on this channel. Nothing but real artists here. And so yeah, I mentioned Craster. We know that Craster giving his sons to the others is sacrificing to the others. And that's how we know Knights King and Queen are making others somehow. But there's an important difference between Craster's wives. Really hard to talk about it without having your skin crawl. But the point is, they're normal women. They're not ice witches. Knights Queen is described in inhuman terms. Her skin is icy cold. She's got the blue star eyes of the others. So it seems like her children are going to be others already. They don't need to be given to the others. They're going to be born as white shadows, just like Melisandre gives birth to magical black shadows. And that would imply that Knights Queen was actually doing shadowbinding when she created the others. And there's a little bit of timeline heresy here. I do think Knights King and Queen is a story about about the first creation of the others, but that is a story for another video. So just running with this theory, the question becomes, why do the white shadows stay? Why do they come to stay when the black shadows don't seem to? Well, the answer is probably that the others are being sustained by these continual sacrifices from the wildlings north of the wall. Because I really don't think they're taking Craster's sons and turning them into new others. There's a lot of evidence that the others are a hive mind, meaning some sort of collective consciousness. And if that's the case, they're just taking the magical mana from Craster's sacrifices and using that to sustain their existence. And that would give us a good answer to why sheep can serve in place of Craster's sons when he doesn't have a son to give the others. The sheep would just be a snack. They're still a living thing. There's a little bit of magic mana there, but not much. And of course, sheep basically symbolize innocence, innocent lambs. And even if I'm wrong about that, even if they are making new others, they are somehow taking these children and converting them into shadows. And that means the others may still be doing shadow binding to this day, and that means that Night's Queen may still be out there somewhere. Or maybe she's in there somewhere, because what about all the ideas about weirwood others? I've made several videos about the others having been formerly green man spirits and weirwood spirits, and both Michael Talks About Stuff and Gray Area are also talking about the others as shadow-bound weirwood spirits. Well, my answer is that Night's Queen is not out there somewhere, but rather in there somewhere. She's in the weirwood net. There's a ton of evidence, in my opinion, that Night's Queen was a child of the forest or a human-child hybrid, someone with a magical connection to the weirwoods. So, for example, most of the characters that parallel Night's Queen, like Lyanna and Val and Morna White Mask, they all have very strong weirwood associations. Lyanna dresses up as the Knight of the Laughing Tree, literally a weirwood knight. Val's got a big weirwood face brooch, and Morna White Mask wears a white weirwood mask. Craster's wives are obviously playing the role of Night's Queen too, and Craster is from White Tree, a town named after a weirwood tree where we find a baby sacrifice. You remember when the Night's Watch went to White Tree in the second book? They found both an adult human skull and a baby human skull inside a weirwood mouth that was charred by fire. And actually, I think that is how you give children to the others. You leave them in the mouth of a weirwood tree. We really do have to get back to shadowbinding proper, so check out the video Secret of White Tree for the full theory. But basically, if Night's Queen is inside the weirwood net, then that would be how you would give the others babies. You'd literally feed the, and I'm sorry, this is kind of dark, but you'd feed the sacrifice to the mouth of the weirwood tree so it could consume the life force. I mean, they are big, scary trees with bloody faces and open mouths, So yeah, Secret of White Tree video, check it out. But that is the answer to how the others are somehow tree spirits and also shadowbound. Night's Queen is either a spirit inside the weirwood net performing this exchange of life energy and shadowbinding, or perhaps she's outside the weirwood net in a physical body, but like I said, a child of the forest or human-child hybrid with the ability to use the magic of the weirwood net. All right, so let's talk about Thoros the Shadowbinder. That's right, he's a Shadowbinder too. Because in my opinion, R'hllorist Resurrection is definitely Shadowbinding. So let's break this down step by step. The R'hllorist Resurrection, quote unquote, isn't actually a restoring of life. Beric's black blood does gush from his wounds in his fight with the Hound. But George Martin has clearly specified that Beric's blood does not flow and that he does not have proper vital processes. We also see that he doesn't need to eat or sleep, and thus we can conclude that he's just a reanimated corpse being piloted by some scrap or remnant of Beric. We might call this his ghost. He does sort of act like a ghost, being obsessed with the last thing that he was doing when he died. We might also call this his shadow, or, a slice of his soul, perhaps. But whatever we call it, it's clearly not the whole thing. It's some sort of remnant that should be in the afterlife, but instead was bound to his reanimated corpse. And that, to me, sounds like shadowbinding. And famously, Beric does give us the zombie's perspective on being reanimated when he says, "Fire consumes." Lord Beric stood behind them, and there was something in his voice that silenced Thoros at once. "It consumes, and when it is done, there is nothing left. Nothing?" "Beric, sweet friend." The priest touched the lightning lord on the forearm. "What are you saying?" "Nothing I have not said before. 6 times, Thoros. 6 times is too many." So one thing we notice about Thoros is that he does seem to be being drained of color and life by his acts of shadowbinding, by his resurrections of Beric. And perhaps this hints at the reason why shadowbinders wear those lacquer masks. That could obviously just be, they're hiding deformities that are caused by the weirdness of a shy. But just as working with fire magic seems to be transforming Melisandre physically, Thoros' increasingly haggard look could be a preview of the direction he's going if he keeps it up. And obviously, we have no idea what horror is lying beneath Melisandre's glamour. A super old lady would probably be the least bad thing that Martin could think of. So Thoros, when he resurrects Beric, he's actually doing two things. He's resurrecting the corpse, and he's calling some part of his ghost back from the afterlife and reattaching them. And we can see this process even more clearly when we think about the way that Melisandre is going to have to resurrect Jon. Because Jon is a skin changer, we know that his spirit is in Ghost, beginning second life, and that we will both need to port Jon's spirit back from the wolf into the body and reanimate the body. So you can see why Shadowbinding will be needed. And in fact, Mel's biggest task may be to reattach Jon's soul to his body. And shout out to Wendy from Peter Pan, sewing Peter Pan's shadow back to his body. And that may be why we have a Shadowbinder at the wall ready to resurrect Jon. Alright, so you like my theory that the R'hllorist resurrections are actually Shadowbinding. The question then becomes, why? Why are the R'hllorists doing Shadowbinding? I mean, Melisandre studied in Ahai and claims to be a Shadowbinder, but Thoros, he would be surprised if you told him he was a Shadowbinder. He might not even recognize the term. In his mind, he's performing a very standard R'hllorist death ritual called the Fiery Kiss. He tells us that all Red Priests learn to do it, and he describes it as being meant to purify the soul of the deceased person. And essentially, he says that when he did it to Beric, surprisingly, it resurrected him, and he wasn't expecting that. So this feels like an ancient ritual that had lost its magical power, but suddenly regained it, suddenly started working again. There are two very good potential reasons why this ritual might have worked again suddenly for Thoros and Beric that I can think of. One is the Westerosi weirwood magic. The Riverlands definitely do have weirwood trees, such as Raventree Hall, home of House Blackwood, and those 33 weirwood stumps that still have magic power on top of the High Heart. Beric, of course, is hanging out in a cave shot through with weirwood roots, which I strongly suspect is under the High Heart. So that certainly could be the explanation. Westerosi weirwood magic. There usually aren't R'hllorists doing the Fiery Kiss in Westeros. So maybe it's that combination. Or maybe it's something having to do with the Red Comet, the end times, and the return of dragons to the world, which is obviously strengthening magic everywhere. Quaithe tells us that specifically, and the Pyromancers also tell us that their spells have been stronger for some reason that they can't figure out, but which we know is the return of dragons. The Red Comet really stands out as a suspect since that might be part of the reason why Dany was able to hatch her dragons in the first place. And because the Bleeding Star is obviously a very prominent part of the Azor Ahai legend and prophecy. So the other reason why it makes sense that the R'hllorist resurrection ritual would be Shadowbinding is Azor Ahai, the mutual interest between the Shadowbinders and the R'hllorists in Azor Ahai. The R'hllorists famously view Azor Ahai as the savior of the world and the champion of their god. That's him, Azor Ahai, champion of R'hllor. And part of the prophecy says that all those who die fighting in Azor Ahai's cause shall be reborn. So perhaps that's not a figurative promise of a heavenly reward, but rather a reference to fire wights, to fire zombies. Perhaps Azor Ahai was literally fighting the forces of darkness with an army of fire wights. Jon is probably going to be a fire wight, and also Azor Ahai reborn, and thus R'hllor's champion, and also the one fighting the others. So the idea that the original Azor Ahai might have fought the others with fire wights, or have been a fire wight himself, is very plausible. Now, the current soldiers of R'hllor are called the Fiery Hand. We see them in the Red Temple at Volantis. But Jon Snow, well, he's got a fiery hand too. His hand was burned when he saved Mormont from the Ice Wight. So in other words, Jon was actually doing the thing that Azor Ahai Reborn is reborn to do, fighting the others and their wights when he got the fiery hand. And he, again, is going to be a fire wight leading the watch against the others. And then he will truly be a soldier of R'hllor and thus the leader of the fiery hand. Now, I strongly suspect that Jon will not be the only fire wight fighting the others. Because in Jon's Azor Ahai dream, as I like to call it, the one where he defends the wall with a burning red sword and fights undead foes that scuttle up the ice like spiders. Well, his only companions are the burning Scarecrow brothers. In real life, those Scarecrow brothers were created to inflate their numbers, and they were named after dead Night's Watchmen, and in Jon's dream, they have caught fire. So yeah, those burning scarecrows, named after dead Night's Watch brothers, might foreshadow undead Night's Watch brothers that are like burning scarecrows. And Beric, the first fire wight we see in the story, is described as a scarecrow who burns with the fire of R'hllor. So to sum up, all this fire white stuff seems to be Azor Ahai fighting the other stuff. And that fits very well for a religion that is dedicated to Azor Ahai. And that means we understand why the R'hllors were raising the dead to fight the others, but we still have the question of why they were using Shadowbinding, apparently, theoretically, to do that. Well, Shadowbinders, officially, the ones that call themselves Shadowbinders, come from Ahai, and so does the Azor Ahai legend and prophecy. And as I mentioned at the top, Melisandre has been a slave of the Red Temple since she was a child, and thus it would have been they who sent her to study Shadowbinding in Ahai. That's not something that she freelanced. And she may not have even had to go to the Shadowbinder temple, which we don't know if there is one, but presumably they have a meeting place somewhere in Ahai, because the R'hllors, in fact, have a huge red temple in Ahai. So it may be that Melisandre simply went to the red temple in Ahai to study Shadowbinding. It was either that, or the R'hllors really do have an exchange student program with the theoretical Shadowbinder temple. But I strongly suspect that students at the red temple of Ahai actually study Shadowbinding as part of their curriculum. Alright, so now let's talk about where the Shadowbinders draw their power from, which seems to be the shadow by which Ahai by the Shadow is by. Ahai by the Shadow is where you go to learn Shadowbinding, and we know that Ahai is a place where your magic spells actually work better, where magic is amplified. Melisandre compares Ahai to the wall, and she names the wall as a hinge of the world, which implies that Ahai is probably a hinge of the world too. And as we're going to discuss in next week's video, what happened to Ahai, Stygiai, and the Shadowlands, the magically toxic effects of the Shadow gets stronger the closer you get to Stygiai, which is called the Heart of Shadow. And it's only the Shadowbinders that go outside of Ahai up the River Ash towards Stygiai. It says that even they're afraid to go to Stygiai, but I don't believe that. What's the point of having a Stygiai if the Shadowbinders can't visit it? Ergo, if we try to isolate what it is about Ahai that is amplifying the magic, it seems like it is whatever in Stygiai that is casting the shadow to begin with. And that makes sense, right? They're Shadowbinders, they're drawing their power from the shadow. So in this sense, the shadow is kind of like a raw source of magical power, just as fire magic or ice magic can be for, say, the Valyrians and R'hllorists, or for the others. So, mild spoiler alert for next week's video, I am going to try to prove that the thing in Stygiai which is casting the shadow is none other than the Bloodstone Emperor's black meteor. I've actually said that before, but I've assembled a really strong case, and I think I'm going to convince everyone that watches the video that that's what's there. And given that the Bloodstone Emperor worshipped the black meteor that fell during the time of the Long Night, and given that all of this out here is very inspired by H.P. Lovecraft, it would seem that Martin is at least softly implying that some sort of dark god or Lovecraftian being has come down to Earth on this black space rock. That's why Bloodstone Emperor worships it, and that's why he does all this dark, twisted stuff. So this would mirror the way that Nyarlathotep, you're not supposed to be able to pronounce the names. It's similar to the way that Nyarlathotep works through the shining trapezohedron. That's a black and red strange gemstone which focuses Nyarlathotep's energy and presence, and it seems like that's what George is mimicking with the Bloodstone Emperor and his black stone. So this shadow entity in Stygiai, this space demon attached to the black stone, that would actually be the thing that the Shadowbinders are drawing power from. And that is why it is no coincidence that Quaithe is using glass candles and is almost certainly a member of the Church of Starry Wisdom, which was founded by the Bloodstone Emperor, worshipper of the Black Stone. And you can check out my Who is Quaithe video for more on that. But the strongest evidence is that scene, Dany's last chapter in A Dance with Dragons, where Quaithe's face appears as a mask of starlight and dispenses wisdom to Dany. So that's literally Starry Wisdom. So all this stuff in Ahai is connected. Starry Wisdom cult, Shadowbinding, Stygiai, the Bloodstone Emperor. And at this point, we can actually form a pretty good hypothesis about what the motivation of the Bloodstone Emperor was when he killed the Amethyst Empress and pissed off the Maiden Maid of Light and caused the Long Night, supposedly. He was enabling the space demon, his god, to come to Earth and grant him unholy power. Alright, so as tempted as I was to spin this off into its own video, Who is R'hllor? Because that's a pretty good thumbnail. My theory about who R'hllor is really depends on everything that we've just talked about, so it did have to come at the end of this video, and again, thank you for watching to the end. So you can probably see where this is going at this point. Could R'hllor be the same as this space demon in Stygiai. R'hllor, the god of flame and shadow. R'hllor, whose servants have been shadowbinding to make fire wights since R'hlorism was created in the days of Azor Ahai, who himself comes from Ashai by the shadow. R'hllor, who has a giant temple in Ashai where the space demon makes all the spells stronger, and where the R'hllorists themselves study shadowbinding. For all we know, the Red Temple of Ashai is the oldest and original Red Temple. Just because it's centered in Volantis nowadays doesn't mean that's the first one. That's not claimed anywhere. So yes, R'hllor absolutely could be the space demon, and I think he is. Many do call him a demon, in fact, and frankly, he's never going to beat that rap as long as his servants keep, burning people alive, especially children. And I would argue that George has pretty clearly spelled out what is villainy versus heroism in his story. Villainy is sacrificing other people to gain power for yourself, and heroism, predictably, is being willing to sacrifice yourself for the good of others and the world. So in terms of that kind of moral compass, R'hlorism aligns more closely with evil. And that may be why George sneaks in a couple references to the fiery eye of R'hllor, especially in A Dance with Dragons when he makes Stannis' tower look like it's the fiery orange eye of some strange god. So these are Mordor Eye of Sauron vibes that George has attached to R'hllor. And what is the Mordor of A Song of Ice and Fire? It's the Shadowlands. And so yeah, that's where R'hllor lives. That's where his fiery eye is cast from. Stygiai, the heart of the shadow. Finally, the Zoroastrian religion of ancient Persia and Iran, from which George, by his own admission, drew from heavily to create R'hlorism, is instructive here. So famously, Zoroastrianism is highly dualistic, just as R'hlorism is. The R'hllorists believe that everything is this eternal struggle between R'hllor and the Great Other, and the Zoroastrians believe in a similar dichotomy between Ahura Mazda, also called Ormazd, and he's the god of goodness and light, and opposing him is Angra Mainyu, or Ahriman, the god of evil thought and darkness. And I'm doing my best with the pronunciations there as always, but I'm sure someone will correct me in the comments, and please do. So yeah, Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, R'hllor and the Great Other. But here's the thing, I don't think R'hllor is Ahura Mazda. The god of flame and shadow would not be Ahura Mazda, because in Zoroastrianism, shadow and darkness are very clearly the purview of Angra Mainyu, which is exactly what Davos says to Melisandre. Shadows, those are the servants of the darkness. And even more instructively, Azor Ahai, the champion of R'hllor, is based directly on Azi Dahaka, who is the champion of Angra Mainyu. The word Azi means snake and dragon in Avestan, and in Vedic Sanskrit, which is like a cousin language to Avestan, it's Ahi instead of Azi. So Azi Ahi is pretty close to Azor Ahai already. And then we have the Avestan word for fire, which is Atar. So basically, Azor Ahai is kind of a mashup of the Persian words for fire and dragon. And that makes sense, of course. Of course. So Azi Dahaka, also called Zahak, he has two primary forms. He's either a three-headed dragon or a snake man, where he's called Snake Shoulder, and the other two heads are now snake heads that are on his shoulder. And Azi Dahaka, or Zahak, he was a kind of king of demons, or devas. So yeah, just going off of the mythology that George drew from to create R'hlorism, it's pretty sus that the R'hllorists are worshipping a god of flame and shadow that seems more like a demon, and a three-headed dragon man as their savior. So, final clue, Azi Dahaka, when he is finally slain, the heroes realize they can't cut him open completely because every wound starts to bleed like toxic vermin and rats and disease and stuff. And so what they do instead is they chain him up on the highest mountain in Iran, which is a dormant volcano, and there he will remain until the last battle. So he's chained up on top of a dormant volcano, the snake dragon god who oozes toxicity. This is the space demon in Stygiai at the top of the Shadowlands, oozing toxicity. That's R'hllor, trapped inside the Bloodstone Emperor's black space rock. And so yes, R'hllor is a space demon. Thank you all for coming. You've been a beautiful audience, and watch out for my Ashai, Stygiai, and the Shadowlands video next week. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, please do. I'm almost to 150K. It's going to be a big milestone, so help me get there. And of course, I'll see you each and every Sunday at 3 p.m. Pacific for Starry Wisdom Sunday.